Here we go. Coming down in 3, 2, 1. In a world where danger lurks in the shadows, where the line between heroes and villains is blurred, a team of extraordinary individuals is about to embark on a mission that will defy the odds. Meet the Deans, a group of the best in the business, each with a particular set of skills that makes them unstoppable. They may be strangers, but when the world is in peril, they come together as one. Get ready for the ultimate adrenaline rush as they take on the impossible. Welcome to the Pipeline edition of the Dean Talks. Today, we're going to talk about learning environments as conduits to societal success or peril. Whether it's school to prison, school to STEM, or school to the labor force, this conversation will force us to look at the role of the school, teacher, and curriculum. Science, technology, engineering, and math advocates have been accused of being more interested in competing on the world's stage of technological advancement at the cost of human individuality and expression, almost like a tech assembly line. On the other side, critics wonder why students aren't taught financial savvy and wealth, especially when they come from poverty, and if there are groups who are consistently not graduating, entering college, and high-performing careers, why haven't there been efforts to correct it? Today, we discuss the classist room. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of hosts or sponsors or Ripe Fruit Foundation. This information is not intended to replace therapeutic or medical advice. This session is being recorded and we will go live on Facebook. I'd like to welcome Ebony Kinney, the founder of Ripe Fruit. Ebony.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to this wonderful panel. So excited about this show, but I'm excited about all the shows. So I'm going to start with Dr. Aja Denise Reynolds. Dr. Aja answered the call. I reached out to her actually, and she answered the call. So gracious to you for that. So she is a healer, activist, artist, and educator. Aja's dissertation titled Ain't Nobody Checking for Us, Race, Fugivity, and the Urban Geographies of Black Girlhood. It sounds like a must read, is her most current work that documents her commitment to collaborative engagement with Black girls, which focuses on creating fugitive and freedom spaces through the use of art, activism, and healing. Aja has over 12 years of experience as an educator, youth worker, including co-leading research for the study In Search of Freedom, Equity, and Justice, Black Girls Dismantle the School to Prison Pipeline. All right. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for being here. Now I want to go to Kendra Appy. Kendra Appy is a therapist and deeply committed to the principles of anti-oppression, social activism, and dismantling systemic barriers. Kendra strives to create a therapeutic space that fosters healing and growth, conscientious awareness of their own privilege, and the belief that dismantling societal norms and fostering personal wellness can be revolutionary acts. And Kendra also answered the call to me. We've done an interview, so grateful also for you for being here, Kendra. Thank you. And then let's go to Matthew Ebert. All right, Matthew Ebert is a human-centered leader with 20 plus years experience. Don't forget my plus, right? Of experience in education, primarily focused on school leadership in urban settings. He is the founder of Ebert Educational Consulting and a TED speaker. His consulting is grounded in his experiences as a teacher, director of academic innovation, and academy leader, and his decade of successful leadership as a public charter school principal. Matthew, thank you for answering the call. I met you in person. You're wonderful. You're awesome. All right, let's have a great conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Steve.
Thank you, Ebony. Let's open up the discussion with a video snippet to set the stage for the panel to join or react.
This group of primary school kids already knows what money can buy.
I think of middle class as my family because my family has enough money to buy like the stuff we need. I feel that my family is rich because, well, they have two wonderful children, me and my brother.
UCLA developmental psychologist Rashmita Mistry studies social stratification and the impact it has on children.
So thinking about education and occupations and income and wealth, we think if we don't draw attention to it, then maybe kids won't think that it's important. And in fact, what we know is it's the opposite.
What I study is intimately connected to my experience as an African American woman that happened to be born on the wrong side of the tracks and wasn't predictably to be here. I also was curious, why was I considered special? People would say, wow, you have an English accent. You do math, really? And I said, well, what are you talking about? You went from DC, Spingarn? So I was trying to figure out, well, why am I special? And what I realized is that there was a perception of STEM disciplines, that they were hard and that only the special could make it.
I mean, I think you have to really come from a disability justice kind of framework. You know, how do we create accessible spaces in general? And yeah, we have to think about all of the different experiences and how can we make space and welcome all of them, you know, so that anyone can come to this space and be comfortable, be safe and welcomed.
My colleagues in the sciences persevered, and we now hear all over the place that we need to make investments in science, technology, engineering, and math. While I actually believe we need to do so, I also realize that what I think of are these grand challenges in the world, these gnarly problems that require us to really mobilize a whole array of talent and research. We can't answer those questions only by asking what a scientist would think of it or an engineer. And in this West African village, there was a need for clean water. The women would trek every day down to the river that was contaminated, and that was actually leading to all kinds of infections that could be prevented. So one of the international agencies provided research and dollars for them to then drill a well. Well, the engineers came in, did their survey, and drilled the well right in the middle of the village. To their surprise, the women walked past the well. And they asked the women a simple question. Why are you walking past the well in the perfectly clean water to go to the river with the contaminated water? And the women said, look, we understand that this water is better here, but you don't understand why we walk to the water. It's not only a utilitarian function of retrieving water, it's a way for us to get away from the menfolk in the village, from the children, to break up the routine of the domestic household.
That was thought-provoking. I know I'm thinking. And that leads us to our first question. Learning environments are expected to be well-planned, protected spaces. How does classism and the other isms show up? Our goal here is to understand deeply and collectively why we need to have this conversation.
So I think as we begin talking, right, it's about who decides what school looks like, who decided what school looks like in this country, and what does success mean? And those are all variations of what people think. Those are all guided by perspectives that are marked a lot by where you come from and the people, you know, with whom you've been raised and society. So I think as we jump into this conversation, that idea that says who made these decisions and how did they become so entrenched really guides the conversation.
I thank you for getting us started, Matthew. So I was thinking, anytime I teach I teach classes for teacher educators, and I always feel the need to start on back of like, how do we understand how schools get created? Which I think are two different things than what we talk about when we're talking about education, right? Schools become this more formalized building that we think that education or learning only happens in this place. I think education is something that happens everywhere, right? Whether you're sitting here talking to your grandfather, you're having a conversation with your neighbor, someone in your neighborhood, right? Like those places could be very much informative in education, those spaces as well, right? That we may not recognize in traditional spaces. But I think this question around like, how do we understand how schools are created is so important, and most people don't understand that. And because a lot of things that we are striving for when we talk about equity and justice in schools, we have seen exist before when we have seen exist, and they're usually often disrupted, right? So I think about freedom schools oftentimes in the South with Black folks, how those became subversive learning spaces. I think about even now how often I have seen in certain communities in Chicago and Detroit, where Black folks just really try to have control over their kids' education, even outside of school spaces, right? And so seeing these spaces that pop up more and more so, where they're engaging Black history, where they're engaging the things that they know are important to their community, but necessarily aren't valued in schools. And so I think oftentimes we're left asking this question of, in pursuit of thinking about what are equitable schools, as if we've never seen them, when really oftentimes those things aren't valued in those school spaces. And so it leads us back to these questions around why not? Who's in charge of schools? And how do we create more spaces where community can have more say about what type of schools they would like to see for their children and where they are?
I love that point of like, as if we've never seen them, right? So it's so easy as someone who's been in schools for 20 years, right? Like to get caught up in the day-to-day of the conversation and like, this is what school looks like and this is what we have to do. And those are all realities, right? Like, and I want to be clear as we have these conversations, none of my judgment is on people inside of schools, right? I've been a person inside of school for a very long time, but this idea that says like, oh, not only does it not have to be this way all the time, but even more so like, why is it still this way? You know, when teaching a class, right, at Taos University about action research, it's this idea that says like, we have lots of data about what works and what doesn't. But somehow in the actual day-to-day of the work, it doesn't matter, right? Like it gets thrown out the window because we have to make decisions quickly. And again, like that's where I very much live in the practitioner world, right? Like I've been a practitioner. I've been that guy who made decisions based on no data and that were wrong, based on the data that were wrong. Like I've done all the wrong things. And this piece that says like, as if we've never seen it before, right? But one of the challenges, I think, is how do we step off the machine even for a minute? Because as the pandemic revealed, right, you can't stop school. If you stop school, people get real hot about it for different reasons, right? But one of the major ones is, where do my kids go every day as y'all are figuring out how to fix this thing? So I think there's like the realities and the vision, but the question I constantly come back to is, it doesn't have to be this way. Why are we still doing this? And I loved your point of, as if we haven't seen it done other ways before.
Yeah, I want to jump in too, because I like that we're talking about the question of how did schools get this way? Why are they this way? And I think in order to answer that too, we have to take a wider view and look at the systems, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, colonization. Like these are all systems that have fed into creating what the institution of school looks like. And I really believe we have to be hard on systems and soft on people. So I like what you said, Matthew, about, you know, not blaming anybody who's working in the schools. And at the same time, as a therapist, you know, I see how these systems live inside each of us in different ways. And so I do think there needs to be a process of confronting that and how they live in our bodies and show up in our decisions and our actions and the spaces that we occupy.
Neuro-inclusive awareness has resulted in more neurodiverse representation in non-traditional career paths than ever. We see them in more creative and intuitive fields and as outspoken advocates. How do we inadvertently assign neurodivergence to particular social classes? And how do we change that behavior?
I really like this question. There's a saying in that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And I'm autistic. So using myself as an example, you know, I'm a therapist. I think that is one of those career paths that's beyond the expected for neurodivergent people, especially autistic people. We're not all destined to be computer programmers or be in STEM. And I know there's a Buddhist Lama Lina, who's autistic. We can be therapists, farmers, performers, artists, activists. So I think at times the idea of aligning neurodivergent people with career paths has been very overly focused on stereotypes and special interests. you know, somebody's special interest might become their career, and that's awesome, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be their profession, especially when we're talking about young kids. So I think that we need to leave a lot of openness for children and adults to explore lots of different skills, lots of different interests. And at the same time, the special interests can be a way to get students interested in other skill building areas. Something else I wanted to name too is just the idea of late blooming. I think a lot of people, especially people who've experienced trauma, systemic oppression, challenges and adversity, they may not be able to or want to dive right into a career after school. And that's okay. You know, that there needs to be, if healing hasn't been allowed to happen in their school career, then there needs to be time for that healing and self-development to happen afterwards. So for me, I took I think like 6 or 7 years before I decided what I wanted to do after school as my job. And I sort of surprised myself, to be honest.
I think that's a great point, Kendra, and I'm actually going to stretch it past neurodiversity and just go to the way where schools, possibly by design, are forced to put people into boxes. And when anybody does not fit the box that we are responsible for tracking, it becomes really hard for schools again, right? My 2 children are both neurotypical, and one will thrive in school simply because she loves to follow rules and please the adult in the classroom. And one will be in the back of the class throwing spitballs at the teacher. That is what is going to be happening, right? It's going to be much easier for folks to say, okay, well, she can do X, Y, Z versus, oh, he'll be able to do this. And I think that hits especially hard for folks who are, you know, who aren't neurotypical, but I think it happens to everyone. And again, I don't actually think it's because of school. I think it's because schools are an extension of the labor force. And, right, school leaders are responsible for checking the box of how many kids are going to go to this high school for STEM, for health, for arts, when instead it's this child is 17 years old or 12. They have no idea what they can or will do as they get older, whether or not they have autism, whether or not they don't, it doesn't matter. They're just a person in the midst of development.
I would just add too, I think Matthew, maybe you brought up even during COVID, right? Like, I think what COVID really showed me is our inability to really meet the needs of all the different ways that our students come into the school space, right? So even as we talk about technology, like, I had a nephew who usually struggled when he was going to the schoolhouse, right, every day, and usually struggled more in school, but somehow was really organized and more on track than his siblings when it came to online schooling, which was like, we were like all surprised about, like, who was going to be the one that woke up on time every morning and do online schooling really well, right? Like, and he was the one who exceeded. But it just made me really think about this question around, like, how much we've seen, how many students were enjoying online schooling and others weren't, right? How did online schooling allow us to reach a certain audience of students who may have certain disabilities or learning disabilities, right? Like, or how it became more accessible for some folks, right, for different reasons. While at the same time, some people still wanted to go to the schoolhouse, right? And so I think just even as I think about COVID, and particularly how COVID becomes this disabilitating moment, right? Like, how many of us also then, because of what happened with COVID, whether contracting COVID ourselves or just the experiences we were having during that time, how that also has impacted how we come back into the classrooms, in the ways that we haven't been able to address nor talk about it because of systemically, we feel like we're checking off check marks in order of how our students are succeeding every day. That has nothing to actually do with the joy they feel when they come to school, has nothing to do with their healing and trauma in the schools, and what we're missing when when we're not taking up that time to address those things.
I mean, just co-sign, affirm, right? Like all the things, especially when we talk about and I mean the collective we, learned all the wrong lessons through COVID, right? Like what we learned that we could do Like I was in schools in COVID and teachers were incredible, right? Like we asked them to do something that was not at all their job, and best of luck to everybody. And everyone on either end of the spectrum was yelling about them, and they did it. For better or worse, they did it. And we absolutely had one student who was never going back to traditional school. That kid was going to be a virtual learner from then on because he thrived. But I think that conversation again goes back to like, what is expected of schools, right? And you said joy, right, Dr. Reynolds? And like it's something schools will talk about. You'll read all sorts of think pieces on joy and relationships, but we don't grade those things. And colleges don't care how happy or sad you were. And we're telling kids again and again that college is the key, right? So again, there's this huge disconnect between what we talk about as being important in society. I don't know about you, Doc, but like I want to work with people who are kind and hardworking. And it doesn't matter to me if they got a C in computer science, right? Like that doesn't ever come up in our conversations. And it's not an indicator of their future success or how useful they will be as a teammate collaborating towards a thing we want. So we talk about the things that are important for childhood. I've heard you say healing and joy, but then what matters is the letter grade on the paper that's determined by the homework you turned in and doesn't take into consideration about the safe place to sleep, the level of education of your family, the resources they have. But we're all judged by the same criteria. And we know it's not fair. And we still do it every single day.
I love what both of you are saying. And I don't work in schools, but I am a dreamer and I really believe in liberation. And you'll probably hear me more than once talking about the systems, but I really like to think about, what if we lived into these values that we're all talking about, what would the world look like? If kids could learn in the way that makes the most sense for them, but also if we actually value the things that, if it were profitable, right, to have certain gifts. Like I think what gets rewarded in these systems is, being greedy, being exploitative, not necessarily being cooperative. I just like to imagine what would the world be like if it were rewarded to be creative and joyful and kind and compassionate, and we didn't have to think so much about like worrying about our kids having to find a path where they can have a dependable paycheck, have medical insurance, which these are things that we need for our survival. But I guess I would love for all of our gifts to really be rewarded and profitable.
The school is a box with what Matthew said. And I'm thinking about that. So, okay, so we've got the box. The building was built back in 1920 or whatever, let's say. So the box is there. The physical address is there. But now, what do we do to change how the inner workings of the box are? And the reason I brought that up is one of the programs that we're working on at Ripe Fruit is classroom design, the use of lighting, the use of space and segregating or separating spaces within the box so that we can have different areas for different students to get different feedback, different stimulation, because we've got the box. That's not going anywhere. How do we tweak that box so that we can enhance these student learners?
This group of primary school kids already knows what money can buy.
I think of middle class as my family, because my family...
Neurodivergent, let's say being on the spectrum, or ADHD, dyslexia, how do you think that can be a strength when it comes to STEM?
Well, a lot of it is thinking outside the box. Anything that's been invented someone has taken what they know and then thinking outside the box, or looking at it from a new perspective by people not thinking conventionally, but looking at it from
different lens.
Yeah.
In our data nationally, what we can see is that about a third of the population come from working class backgrounds, but about 10% of that group will make it into elite occupations.
10% of working class people will make it into elite occupations?
Yeah. And even when those from working class backgrounds make it into Britain's top professions, they go on to earn on average 16% less than their colleagues from more privileged backgrounds. really this is sort of a fairly stark rejoinder to notions of meritocracy in this country.
Often within the city, if we're talking to hiring managers, they'll summarise what we mean with the word polish. So they'll be looking for candidates who they believe are particularly polished in the way in which they present. Now, that can be quite an ambiguous term, but if we break it down, it can include things like accent, maybe mannerisms, maybe behaviour, also dress, those kind of things that can present or denote middle or upper class status.
Mika, this research is really interesting. It found that when students and adults of all genders are given the advice to follow your passion, they were more likely to choose jobs that are consistent with gender stereotypes, which is to say women were more likely to choose jobs in art and healthcare, men were more likely to choose jobs in science and business. And yet, when the advice changed and these students and adults were told, pick a job that leads to security, better benefits, higher pay, the gender divide decreased. Women were more likely to choose jobs in STEM fields like computer science and engineering. And I think the takeaway here, it's really important. We're not saying that people need to be miserable in pursuit of money, but we do know that career choice is one of the largest drivers of the gender pay gap. So what these researchers are recommending is that women and girls are exposed to things like computer science and accounting from a young age, so they know they have an interest and could pursue those fields later on.
Because we've turned our public schools into spaces for discipline, control, and surveillance, many of the policies that impact students push them out of schools and push them usually into the juvenile justice system, and that becomes a pathway to negative consequences throughout life. Mass incarceration is expensive, it wastes lives, it wastes money, so let's figure out how to do something about it. And much of that is right. What's not right about it is assuming that it's just about boys. The ways that girls are pushed out of school and disciplined and punished, often for being Black, fell outside of the way the issue was even framed.
There is no denying the link between low literacy and incarceration. Can you tell us a little bit about your research in the school to prison space, Dr. Reynolds?
Thank you. And that was such an appropriate transition going from Kimberly Crenshaw, whose work really inspired many of us as I was going through my doctoral program of how we have these conversations, using intersectionality as a framework. Because I think part of that was missing in how we also think about classism if we're not having a conversation about race and gender. And so that's what brings me to the work that I do at this point, which is a combination of two things, right? And so I engage in work around abolition, school abolition in particular, but also prison abolition, because the two are entangled. And part of that is because even this question around school to prison pipeline, many of us have shifted from talking about it as a pipeline, because the reality of it is that most students will not necessarily be pushed directly into a prison system, right? Even with literacy, right? Like, literacy will impact other parts of young people's lives or adult lives that may lead them in ways of having to navigate the world untraditionally, in ways to survive, right? But we don't necessarily see, like, we don't necessarily have real data around, like, if students start reading are behind in 4th grade, that they're automatically going to go to jail. What has happened over the years is that our work has expanded to really think about the school to prison nexus. And how that differs from the school to prison pipeline is really helping us how school itself operates as a prison, right? And prison-like, and I want to make that distinction because in prisons, people can't go home, right? Like, there are things about prison that we know function very uniquely and distinctly about that experience, in ways that we know don't happen in schools. But we see this relationship of how carcerality also operates in school spaces as it has in places like prison, and how those spaces actually borrow from one another. Or even when we look into things like who funds schools and who's funding prisons, or there's such these deep relationships between all of these different spaces that really brought us to thinking about, like, how do we understand schools as a place that operates as prison? and what changes and how that helps us change, then it makes us change our lens, and it helps us to change our lens from really thinking about even other folks' experiences in that school. Because when we were having this conversation, we are only looking at the rates of who was expelled, which was at a high rate was Black boys. When we start to look inward around how schools were functioning as prisons, we start to disproportionately see Black girls show up in data in ways that were really harmful and how they were experiencing violence in schools. So my work has really been part of continuing to both look at the ways of these Black girls' experiences in schools with carcerality, but also the ways that they're resisting those spaces and navigating through those spaces, whether through their healing, whether through their resistance, in the ways that they're trying to disrupt those systems. Additionally, work that I do is just really thinking about with Black girls here in the city of helping them trace the history of abolition as it has evolved within Detroit. That has been really important work as they are able to make this relationship all the way back to slavery, of thinking about what are some of the technologies that we see present in those moments, even present in these moments of how we educate and discipline Black girls and Black children within schools. And so that's just like some of the work that I'm engaged in with young people, with their voices at the center of thinking about what are they seeing in this history and what are ways that they want us to work with them to disrupt how these systems are operating in those ways.
Dr. Reynolds got a book out yet? I mean, where do we get the book? Is that, I'm not the only one, right?
I'm so inspired. I want to hear more.
Eventually, one day.
Okay. It feels like you should close the computer and just start writing, is the honest thing. I don't think it's for the podcast or the panel. I mean, what you said struck so many chords, right? And in hearing it, a few thoughts that I thought like really were nice reframes, right? So one, schools are absolutely about compliance. That is how they're set up. And it's also, just so you know, for the folks who work in them, that's what's expected of us, right? So like how we treat adults is how we treat children, right? And to Kendra's point, to you and I are very different people, Kendra, and that's okay. But you think about like what we could be, right? And I'm looking at what it is and what I've experienced and what I've caused, right? Where have I harmed? Where have I helped, right? On every aspect. In 20 years of dealing with children, I have absolutely harmed at points, right? Like I would argue that we all have at some point, right? Whether we know and make a different step moving forward is the game. But I love that instead of the pipeline, you talk about the nexus. And it had me thinking at the other end of this conversation of like, what is the nexus of success, right? Now, success is a loaded, tricky word, right? Depending on so many things. But your comments made me think of two books. One is Paul Tuff's book about how children succeed. And he talks about the difference between students in independent schools or private schools and students in public schools. And one of the great comments in that book is there's no ceiling on kids in public schools. They can do anything. But there is a floor on kids at private schools because of who they know, how they've been connected, the networks, and the secret handshakes that they've learned, right? It's not actually about them. It's about all the things that surround them. And so when we look at schools and say they're the cause of XYZ, they're part of a larger ecosystem, right? Like it's not just schools. And it's never fair to give them all the blame. And it's never fair to give them all the credit either, right? But they are part of an ecosystem for better or worse. The other book that made me think of was Dr. Clint Smith's How the Word Was Passed, or How the Word Is Passed, right? When he talks about the prisons that are built on plantations, or how are we having these conversations now where, you know, it's a different note, a different time, but it's the same music that we're playing, right? And I think that speaks to when you're having kids trace back who was here before them, what did it look like, and who are they now, and where's that from? But I think my biggest takeaway to your prison light comment, which is not true of every school across the nation. Absolutely. I don't think you would say it is, right? That's not, but I will sit here and say, right, like the focus is on compliance, even from the level of education when you're going through undergrad programmings and graduate schools. We're talking about compliance with curriculum. We're talking about compliance with this, and we're talking about assessment. And there's nothing inherently wrong with curriculum. There's nothing inherently wrong with assessment. But when we force adults to focus solely on those things and make everything else in service of that, is how I think we get to prison light. right? We confuse order with education because that's what makes sense to adults. When kids are walking in straight lines in the hallway, it feels safer. It feels like everyone's meeting the mark instead of, we never have to do this as adults, except maybe at the airport, and that's chaos, right? So like, what are we doing? What are we focused on? And to Kendra's earlier point, like what matters and what world are we envisioning? What are we building towards? So, but I'll get the book and I'll sell the book. So if you need someone to, process it, I got you. I'm out here.
But I also wanted to say real quick, Matthew, I love how you always bring us back to how teachers are also having this experience, because we don't talk about that enough, and how like these relationships are socially engineered by folks that control schools, like folks who are capitalists and millionaires and billionaires and neoliberals, right? And so because of that, meaning like that socially engineered relationship, right? And so like there's these administrators who have to now respond to somebody, right? And then there's these teachers who have to now respond to them. And then there's these young people who have to, right? And so it's this system of like, and then parents, right? Like people like and so it becomes like everyone's frustrated with everyone, right? And so we're always looking for like who to exactly blame in the actual schoolhouse about why things happen the way they are. Without being able to like collectively together find solidarity around the fact that there are people who are making decisions about particularly students who go to low income schools, who are majority Black and brown schools, right? Who are making decisions about their schooling that also don't have their own kids going there, right? Or have no true investment in our communities or children.
I mean, right? Like, yes, and to all of it. And I think the piece is, right, as a school principal, if you say my school is beholden to hit this XYZ check mark, I'm going to get you that check mark, right? Like, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. And at what cost is the conversation, right? Like, because the people on top won't feel it, right? When we even talk about the absenteeism crisis or the shortage crisis of teachers, the words are all wrong because the people who are talking about it aren't in the school, aren't living it day to day. Right, to your, I forget which family member it was, you said it was like, they did better virtually. Like, okay, like, because there was something that wasn't working for them. But on paper, they're just an absent kid. Like, no, they're not just an absent kid, right? There's a lot behind that. And then, why are we holding the teacher accountable for the child's absentee, right? Like, it's one of those things where it's easy to talk about it when you're outside the work. Let me tell you something. Teachers are incredible. Principals are incredible. Their jobs are super hard, lonely, and incredibly rewarding. And it's exhausting. I don't know any folks who got into the work other than to help. That's why they got in the work. All of that gets obscured constantly. And there are moments and there are glimpses and there's good work and real relationships happening. But when we talk about school as the bigger picture, to your point, it's compliance. It's how many kids went where to school, how many kids are attending each day, are they in uniform? It's not about Dr. Asia Reynolds and Matthew Ebert. It's what are your numbers? What are your marks? That's how we decide if your school is good.
I don't mean to talk about the schools when I'm not in them, but I do want to say something. Dr. Reynolds, I loved hearing about some of the work that you're doing, helping Black girls feel empowered and educated about some of this history. And I think that it's important to, and also I think Matthew, you were saying at what cost, right? When kids are, school age kids especially, they're rapidly making beliefs about themselves and the world around them based on how they're being treated. And so if they're getting in trouble a lot at school, they're gonna probably make a belief about themselves that they're a bad kid, that they don't belong in school, it's not for them. And then if they're kids understand social hierarchies from a very young age before school age. So if we don't talk to kids of all different classes and identities and positionalities about these histories and help them understand that people don't just get what they deserve, right? That's a logical fallacy. These social hierarchies, like we've been saying today, really determine where you might end up in life. And so if we can talk to kids about that, it is a form of resistance, which is trauma treatment and prevention, to be able to do that for kids.
What changes need to happen in areas like classroom design, assessment innovation, learner access, and teacher retention and development?
So thank you for that. And I think all of these pieces are intertwined, right? And so as we talk about these pieces, right, I think there's a couple of overlying conversations that impact everyone. I was meeting with a school leader this week, and they're working towards making their school building more inclusive. We're talking about special education in this conversation, right? They know the numbers, they know what they should be doing, they've seen the impact, and they want to do this. And they've set up a beautiful system, they truly have, to start the work and start the conversation. They have been thoughtful with their team. And we talked about the curb cut effect, right? We talked about this idea because when you ask adults to change things, it's hard. It's hard for all of us to change. Nobody wants to change. And so this curb cut effect is, the idea that implementing curb cuts in cities was initially for one group of people. But what we found is that, oh, this is better for everyone. And there's lots of good examples in life about curb cuts, right? They're used for people with wheelchairs and strollers and equipment that needs to be brought on. And they're actually easier for folks who have bad knees, right? All of these pieces. And so in this conversation, we talk about redesign. My passion, my work has become, that's actually around the adults as well, right? Because the adults in school get the same treatment as kids in school. That is what continues happening. The need for school isn't more sales pitches from outside folks saying this will fix the problem. This is our signature solution and it will create everything wonderful. There is none of that. Ongoing embedded mentorship with folks doing things that have worked. Because just like in any organization, we do things the way that we've seen them modeled for us. So if our leaders and teachers that we've had have done things a certain way, that is most likely how we're going to do them, whether it's effective or not, whether the data says to do it like that. So there is a need for mentorship because it's not a teacher retention crisis or teacher shortage, it's a teacher retention crisis. And that piece has to do with who's teaching our kids. First year teaching is impossible. It's super hard. I want my kids taught by somebody who's been there for a little while, who's had the reps, who's learned, who's made the mistakes, who's gotten better, and who's being mentored by somebody who's been effective or successful. And that's what we want for our adults, and it's what we want for our kids. And that curb cut, that individualization speaks to, yes, classroom designs. Schools should be designed much more around homogeneous and heterogeneous groupings, time for each, and personalized learning. It shouldn't just be the box. It shouldn't just be, this is what we're doing, and if you're not on par with this, then you're not enough. And that goes back to the points from folks in this panel, right? About how we start to ascribe the language that's used towards us, towards ourselves. I'm not an honor roll student because I didn't make honor roll. I'm not a highly effective teacher because I didn't get that on my evaluation. It's all the same. So when we talk about, the tagline of moving away from this and all this kind of work, it's how do we not necessarily individualize all of it, but make it more human, make it more reactive and appreciative of the individual sitting in front of me versus the boxes we're all supposed to fit inside of.
I love that. I think something that kind of goes alongside what you're saying and hasn't been explicitly said yet today is also nervous system regulation. It's so important for kids in learning environments, and it's also important for our teachers and other adults who are in the building, and our nervous systems respond to each other. So if we're in a school environment where the adults, the administrators, the teachers are very stressed, the kids are going to be more stressed, that's going to, they're not going to be able to learn, teachers are not going to be able to teach effectively. And so I think part of what you said, Matthew, about making it more human, that's something that I kind of put together with that idea. Making it more human means making a space where we can feel connected and safe. That's going to work better for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, so just Kendra, because we have the data on it right to your nervous system piece, at schools where there's more turnover of teachers, right, or staff, the work gets put on the people who stay and they leave more frequently. And those schools are, according to data, generally less achievement, or there's less achievement according to whatever state testing we're used, right? So there's also issues with metrics and community matters and ecosystems, all these things matter, right? But that makes sense, and we have it in the data, right? People are leaving, people who are staying are more stressed, they leave, the kids don't do as well, and the cycle continues, right? Like, so where does that stop? Where does that curve? It's the job of being a teacher, working in the schoolhouse in general, needs to be more human, and not just because that's better for the adults, it's better for the kids.
I wanted to leave space for you, Aja, but I just had one more thought. Just that another thing that helps teachers feel more regulated is if they are making enough money to be able to survive, and thrive. So I think that's, I know that teachers need higher pay, better working conditions, more resources, and especially in the schools where achievement is low. I'm guessing the research would suggest that that's not happening.
I mean, and I think about this always from the teacher educator side, is that we also aren't doing a lot of that work even when they're coming through their programs, right, to become teachers. And so we brought up this question, this ideal around like, how do we even measure like joy happening in school or kindness, right? And I always teach a lesson in one of my classes around love. Like, no one ever asks teachers, do they love children, right? We never talk about love as like part of the job of something that we do, right? Like, we talk about it as maybe emotion, but not an actual action. And so I always draw on like Bell Hooks' work and thinking about transforming the classroom as a way to think about like, what does love look like in action? And right, when we're not helping teachers understand that for themselves, it's going to be so difficult to help them to understand that for their students. And that's why, Kendra, I really appreciate when you said you're a dreamer, because that is like, in order for us to really reimagine education, we have to be dreamers, right? In ways that education hasn't allowed us to be dreamers. I think about this even with my students in terms of like, when I ask them to do creative projects, they struggle, right? And one of my close friends / colleagues was like, remember, this is the generation of students who did all standardized testing as most of their schooling, right? And so their inability to dream keeps them too in this will of learning is order and compliance, right? If I ask them to read a text and have a critique about the text, they don't even know where to begin because they're like, I didn't know I can critique the text, right? And so we see that like even start even sooner before they get to a school building of what we see in these teacher education programs, and that we're not disrupting these things as well. And so what we really release our students into, and then continue to see how the retention rates are happening within school spaces of who stays and who leaves.
So I'm just going to expand on that for a minute and go with, yes, the teacher prep programs sold. And at the same time, listen, being in schools, right? Like, teachers get 45 minutes to stop teaching in front of kids. And that 45 minutes is really 30 minutes because there are kids coming in and out of your room all the time, or an administrator be like, hey, just need a minute, or there's a meeting, right? Like, so what we also know is that like adults don't need more time in front of kids actually to be more effective. They need more time to themselves, right? Or collaborative, this and that. And again, when we talk about like what we've learned from history, like, we know that standalone professional development doesn't work. We know it's ineffective, and we know people do not like it, right? Like, I've been in rooms, so it's like, this is all, we know this is a collective joke, right? Like, this is cool, but we're going to do it instead of me setting up my classroom or calling those families, right? There is so much on an educator's plate all the time. They're like, listen, Doc, I agree. Joy and love and all those pieces. That's what we talk about. That's what matters, right? It matters to my children in schools and adults. That's what any of us want, right? But their days, when we talk back to, Ken just pointed about systems, are not set up for that. Their days are set up for group A, group B, group C, pause because the government said I have to give you a pause, group D, group E, group F, right? Like, oh, and now do this. Oh, and teacher X is out, so I'm gonna need you to cover this. Don't worry about using the bathroom, right? Like, that's how their days are set up. So when people come from outside talking about what we need to be doing, it's like, y'all go in the building. There's a reason that people aren't seeking to become teachers, and it's not because they don't love kids, and it's not because they don't want to teach. I'm gonna say it, Ebony, like, there are better jobs. If I'm 22, 23, 24, and I want to go and make that much money, I can work on my computer at a beach somewhere, right? And I can use the bathroom when I want to and eat when I want to, and I don't have to live inside this box that y'all have set up for me. So I think all of that matters when speaking about retention, recruitment, love, joy. The job is really hard, and not just because instructing kids is hard and bringing excitement and energy is hard, because we have set it up that your day-to-day is really hard.
How do we gauge and how do we grade these students or this content, these content creators that are not in the traditional lane?
So what I'll share is like, I don't generally speak in broad terms, right? But I'm going to go back to Kendra's point about what the world should be, what we lean into. So if one of the goals currently in society of schooling is college, right? And that is part of it, right? And we can all have feelings about that. I certainly do, right? It is a zero-sum game. And when people talk about schools specifically on the internet or to their friends, they talk about good schools and bad schools. Not super coded language. And it's actually not that coded, but like it is intentional, right? And it covers just so many things. I do think there's competitive nature. I will share with you that the only reason I was able to evolve in my job and get better was because of two groups. One, the very smart, mostly women inside the building who gave me space to do it and told me when I was doing a terrible job, right? And helped me along the way. And a network of folks who I was able to reach out to for help. I want to be clear on this. That wasn't the organization that was set up. I happened to be okay with reaching out to people and asking for help, and everyone was happy to help. But that's not how it's set up. It is a zero-sum game. We can talk about how it shouldn't be. But when you talk about one of your earlier questions about how do we actually make it better, well, who benefits if we do make it more equitable, right? Just like any other time in history, the people on top, right? They don't benefit if it becomes more equitable. And so they're not inclined to want to change it. And I don't know how political we're supposed to get, or I don't know how the internet works, but like, remember, there are communities where people are shouting about what can be included in a history textbook that is just history, that is just like fact. It is not commentary, right? Like, this happened and we should talk about this because it impacts everyone, right? To Kendra's point about white supremacy, right? Like, we all swim in it, right? It helps some, it hurts others, right? But we all swim in it, right? So like, how are we having these conversations? To your point of like the competitive nature, people care about society when they talk about it, and then they go home and they care about their children and they care about the opportunities they have. And it's important to note the different like conversations we're having, because I can say that I want your child to have all the same opportunities as mine, but do I want them at the expense of mine? Well, that's a hard, real thing, and it's meaningful. And I'm not saying there's a right answer, but that's a lot of the ways that schools across the country have to interact. Because if you're doing great, am I second place? And I think goes back to schools should be hubs of innovation where kids are cared about, adults are cared about, where ideas are sparked, where value is not assigned but encouraged. And it's a beautiful thing for kids or typical neurodiverse, regardless of economic class. In America especially, we have the resources. We can do this. But who does it benefit to change is the question.
I mean, very much so, competition has really taken away from people engaging education as this learning opportunity, right? I think about this. I think one of the things that we never talked about enough in the media is when Atlanta had that testing scandal and those teachers were actually, went to court and everything, and was, how some of them are going to have to do jail time because they cheated on the test, right? And part of it, right, I think it did become this national or like this more popular conversation in the media or even in our schools because the teachers were Black teachers, right? And I think that very much played a role and people saw them as disposable, because also we see Black teachers in a particular way already, right? In terms of how we see their relationships to schools. But I think something that was really important about that we had to really sit with when we thought about teachers cheating on a test, on standardized tests, right? Is like, what was the means to why they felt like they had to engage in such an action in defense of their children, right? Like, what system did we create that folks feel like they have to cheat and lie and figure out other ways to navigate this system that may not be ethical, right? Particularly, I learned at that time how many other schools do exactly that to get their students through. And I will say I learned that across both schools that had majority Black and brown students, and also across income, right? Like talking to teachers that I knew that worked in predominantly white schools with upper class students who talked about how they cheat on tests, right? And so it just really made me just think about how all these different measures that we have in the play that forces us to compete, right? And we're forcing folks, right, who are at certain schools with a limited amount of resources, limited amount of income, to compete with a school that have all the resources and all the income, right? And never addressing the actual issues around how certain schools are disenfranchised or have less funding, right? But they're still expected to meet and exceed at a certain position. And so, I mean, we just continuously see that to be detrimental to how people can even engage the ideal of what we're supposed to be doing in schools versus what we feel like we have to do to even just think we're going to be afloat next year and open.
I love that the abolitionist stance too, on looking at the why, and you said unethical, I like to think too about just because this is a rule or this is a law, ethics are a different thing, and so if the question is to keep the school open, to get the funding that they need, then yeah, it becomes ethically, it is an ethical question, the choice to cheat.
The heavily cited book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, says that by design, there will always be a working class. As we consider schools as pipelines to everything from the labor force to STEM fields, what power do the people have to shift the paradigm? And what does that look like in your view?
I'll just quickly jump in here. So one thing that comes up for me is I was privileged enough to live in Chicago in between 2010 and 2019. When I was in Chicago, we had the largest teacher strike in 2012. And I was a part of some of the organizing that happened in the community, and working with teachers. And I think for me, that moment has always been just this moment of hope of what I can imagine on a larger scale of what it means to disrupt schooling as it exists, in pursuit of something else, right? And I say that because what I think a lot of people didn't see is the labor that happened even before 2012 that allowed 2012 to happen. So some of the unique things about it is that, at the time, we also were seeing both Republicans and Democrats like trying to disrupt any type of union forming, right? Or making it harder for unions to exist. And so one of the things that had changed around that time is that the authorization, I think, for teachers to go on strike went from like 75 to like 85% or something like that, right? And so that happens. And so, of course, those who are above are like, part of the state are like, they are never going to be able to get that many teachers to agree to go on strike. And I remember they got 90%. But what made me so intrigued, like that in itself was a celebration, but I was so even more intrigued of like, how did you get teachers to agree 90% in one of the largest urban school districts in the country? And while running on things like racial justice, running on things like we have to address race, class, and gender in our schools, right? We have to address that what is happening to Black teachers being pushed out as a result of school closings, right? And I was like, how would it? And so the media was trying to fuel this feud between parents and the teachers of being like, when the teachers went on strike, of course, of like, where will your kids go? How would they neglect your children? And it was so beautiful to see how much the parents stood behind teachers because of years of relationship building that happened even before we got to this point, that really disrupted what I was saying earlier about how the system creates these tensions in the social engineer relationships between teachers, families, the administrators, right? Like that, because they understood that early enough in their work, that they were able over the years to really say, how do we see ourselves as all part of this community? And what are the issues that are plaguing our community that are intersecting with the type of education that we're able to give children? And how can we use a labor contract to organize against those things, right? And so I always just hold that for me in thinking about that people have more power than we think. And that when folks are allowed the opportunity to organize and have the space to look at these systems together and say, what are these interlocking conditions, right? That we need to be looking at, that we need to be building coalitions around and addressing, right? And so it's so interesting to me even now when you go to Chicago of the relationships between something like the Amazon strikers and the Chicago Teachers Union and the folks who drive the bus who are in, right? Like there's such these tight relationships once folks were able to really see and identify all the ways their struggles are interlocked and what it meant to really form coalitions and move in solidarity.
So I think that hits on so many pieces, and I don't think anyone's going to say it better than Dr. Reynolds. But I would say, getting involved is a privilege, right? So when we talk about like what you can do, right? How can the people do things? People who show up to board meetings who end up on television, they have the time to show up to those board meetings, right? So I'm going to pull it back and say, yes, showing up, being involved is important. But if the people who a lot of the families that I worked with, even if they wanted to show up for that, they couldn't. They worked jobs that were hourly. They couldn't be. It's not that they didn't want to be there for the kids or have their conversations, but they couldn't. So I'm going to pull it back and say, what people can do is vote for folks who are going to make sure they have the space and time, which has to do with healthcare, right? Having it regardless of being employed, a livable wage, and housing, right? Because I can show up at my kid's school because I'm not concerned about those things at this moment in time. So I can show up to help the school, to help when things come up for my child, right? But those are only things I can do from a place of privilege, right? Like that's the only reason I can do them. The families that I worked with, they wanted to do it too, and many could, but sometimes they couldn't because they can't fight the battles if you're trying to make it through the day, right? And so like, I think Chicago is amazing and a unique example, if I'll be so bold, of like, you know what, like we all recognize we need each other. And this is not like, this needs to get better, right? So I think to make it so people can actually have these conversations or look at these things or think that things could or should be different, they need the time and space to do it. And school is part of that ecosystem, telling the truth, having the honest conversations, giving adults space and time to create the caring conditions for children and adults, sure, but also the rules that govern our lives are dictated by a lot more than just school. And so even if I want to have a voice, I need to have space and time to have that opinion and say it out loud.
Yeah, it's so by design, right, that we aren't given the space and time to really fight against the systems that are keeping so many of us down. And I do view it, I tend to come more from a grassroots kind of community-based lens when I think about like using people's power, so like Dr. Reynolds was saying, and I definitely couldn't say it any better, but coalition building is really important. I also think, mutual aid in your own community, skill sharing. We don't need to wait for someone in power to come along and change things for us. What do we have within our own power, especially when we're coalition building with people who have a lot of different means, and when we're really looking at ourselves on a even playing field and not playing into those social hierarchies that exist everywhere else.
Yeah, I was gonna say like Chicago's unique in their tactics. They're unique in how they use labor unions, but I don't think they're necessarily unique in how people have come together, right? Like I see that even here in Detroit and stuff like that. And so like I do think there takes a certain privilege to be able to have time and space. I also think it has been traditional for Black folks to create subversive spaces in their communities, right? And so like how they have used church space to do that, right? Like how they have used already spaces that they engage with as a way to do that. I think the issue becomes, particularly in educational spaces, is that all of those spaces aren't meeting, right? Like, so for example, like as we continue to see teachers not from part of the community, Now, I'm not a person who necessarily thinks that people have to live in the community, but I do think they need to be immersed in that community, right? And I think those things are lost in terms of like all of us who are impacted by the educational space aren't necessarily immersing in the communities that we're serving and working for and learning from them and saying, how do we elevate and support those causes? Because those conversations are already happening, right? Like their analysis is already there, right? Around these questions that they're asking, like just like we are around their children's education journey, right? And the things they want to see for their kids. And so it's like, how do we create more spaces and make sure that we're learning from them and taking them into the privileged spaces that we might have the opportunities to go?
A quick case study, and let it go to the panel for feedback. And it's Laura goes to a progressive high school. She loves science and excels in it, but when she fell behind in math, the ball began rolling toward a diagnosis that she only half claims. To her, it feels like taking on this label will limit her for life, although guidance counselors, teachers, her mom, and her therapist all seem to be on board. She's wondering if she should just accept the reality, quote unquote, and accept her new position. How would you advise her? Panel?
I would love to speak on this as a mental health professional, because I can really understand anybody having reservations about taking on a label like a diagnosis. The field of psychiatry and mental health diagnosis has been used to control people and oppress people and uphold these violent systems that we've all been talking about today. And so there is potential for harm. And as someone who is empowered to diagnose by these systems, I do think it's really important for us to question this tool and why we might use it. And are there ways to support students without having to give them a label? I think when it comes to diagnosis, it's often related to medical insurance companies requiring that you have a certain diagnosis to get certain medications or types of support. But there might be ways to subvert this. And I think it's also really important for clients and their parents, if we're talking about kids, to have all the information they might need to make an informed decision about taking on a label like that.
Doc, I was leaving space for you.
No, I was just going to say thank you, Kendra, for your expertise, right? I mean, I'm not an expert in that way at all, but I think the first questions that always come up for me, or even understanding for folks who do this work of is around the question around like, helping them understand why somebody wouldn't want to label, right? Especially someone who's already may have other marginalized identities of like why they wouldn't want to take on a label because how much even more they're already pushed to the margin, and how people use that oftentimes to weaponize, right, against that person. So definitely more so for me is thinking about like helping other folks in the room understand like why someone would want to resist that label in that way.
So both these things come into play oftentimes. And so I've worked predominantly in urban communities for 20 years, right? And to our previous point, or to Dr. Reynolds' previous point, I'm an interloper in these communities, right? Like that's been a reality, right? That's what I've called myself, right? Relationships and trust matter in every context, and specifically this one, right? Because we know there's an overrepresentation if we're talking about students and IEPs. I was myself a kid on an IEP and the third of 3 children. And so, but also the child of a teacher, right? So these pieces all matter when having these conversations with families, right? Because the diagnoses or the labeling will provide access and opportunity that you may not be able to get without it. And so can be crucial, right, to lifting up all the best pieces, right, and to supporting those different areas. And also, if handled in a certain way, can be a stigma depending on context, right? We were often at odds with the folks at the school district who said, well, we don't want to give this child a one-to-one because that could be a stigma in high school. And you might say like, okay, sure. My child's not on track to graduate middle school right now because of the challenges they're facing. We know the support will help. The family would like the support, right? So like even by folks who, by their own admission, may be looking out and trying to combat a stigma. It's like, but what does this child need in the moment? And forgive me, and this is maybe not a popular point. The child's opinion does matter in those moments, but everyone's opinion matters in those moments as well, right? Because 12-year-olds' brains aren't yet fully developed. My wife would say that mine was not fully yet developed, right? But like having the experiences and education that I have, for better or worse, provides me a lens. If we don't get this child this label right now, what does the next 3 years look like? And to also put it out there that like labels can define us and also don't have to by any means. But again, I think to Kendra's point is like, depends on who's in the room having that conversation, right? Depends on who's at home with you having that conversation. Depends on what your experience in school and other avenues where you're socialized has had to say, yeah, I'm a child with an IEP. I'm also a lot more than that. It's another puzzle piece to hopefully help fill out who your child has always been and what opportunities they have. But there are no clear answers. And as always, relationships and context is king.
I think this kind of is where, Matthew, you have such a view of what, the right now, what is this, what does this look like right now for students in real time? And then I'm like just questioning everything, because I do want to say, diagnosis in, psychiatric diagnoses, they are just labels. It's not an exact science. It's not, when you look at the history of other labels that have ended up in this manual, it's damning, the kinds of things that we've pathologized. So yes, I agree. I mean, I do think it's really important to look at harm reduction and the needs right now of the kid and make the best decision you can. And I also just, I'm, the psychiatric, field has just been used to uphold all of this violence. So it's worth questioning, in a bigger picture way.
How could someone get in touch with you if they have questions?
I am a therapist in Washington State. I see individual clients, and I also have 2 groups that I offer periodically. One is a emotion processing group for people with collective liberation values. And the other is called Body Liberation, and it is a processing group for people to look at their relationship with their bodies and food through a anti-oppression lens. And I will put my contact information in the chat if that works.
Excellent. Thank you very much for contributing to today's Dean Talks. Dr. Reynolds, what are you working on, and how can folks get in touch with you?
Sure, I am working on sabbatical. I'm an assistant professor at Wayne State University. My work is at the intersections of Black education, Black girlhood, and abolition. So those are the conversations I'm always in, whether I'm doing research and organizing, running a summer co-facilitating a summer program this summer with some young Black activists in the city who are continuing to trace this history around abolition. And I can be found at Wayne State, which I can put also my email in the chat as well.
Well, right now I'm just trying to catch up with Dr. Reynolds, to be honest with you. After I figure out that, if I do. Right now, I'm working in the space with school leaders and schools to honestly put in systems and structures in place that make school more sustainable for adults. And while that's never going to be the most popular opinion, my work has revolved on the idea that if school is more sustainable and human for adults, we can stem the crisis of retention, and that becomes better for kids. So we do coaching, we work with schools on separate projects, we work in the schools around scheduling, around professional development, all those pieces, of, again, ongoing mentorship and support. You can find us on LinkedIn at Ebert Educational Consulting, or I'm at Matthew Ebert, on Twitter at Ebert Education, or Instagram at Ebert Educational Consulting. And I'll put my information in the chat.
Anyone can visit rightfruit.org to contact our speakers and get notes from this session, complete with a list of backup references. Ebony, what big hits and takeaways do you have from today's session?
Okay, first, let me just say such a robust conversation, and I wouldn't be sitting here and enlightened if it wasn't for each and every one of you. So I noticed we had some audience members. You go ahead and raise your hand or put some love, feedback, chime in the chat. Would love to hear from you before we close out finally, but I do want to run through some of the big hits that just resonated with me the most. We started out with this big question of what is expected of schools and who is expecting it, right? Like we brought perspective into the conversation. I heard the execution can degrade the plan. We could have this plan that is just theory and we decided how we want it to be, but in execution, it just kind of can chip away at that. So I think it was Matthew who said, stop the machine, just stop the machine for a moment. And so the art of how that could happen, my imagination just really enjoyed playing with. I think it was Kendra who said, hard on systems, soft on people, right? And that systems live inside of us. And that's a real one for us to think about, that whatever it is we're combating on the outside, we're combating it within ourselves, and we owe it to ourselves to recognize where that is. There's this conversation about being a late bloomer as a neurodiverse person, right? So the widest umbrella of it, and how leaving room for that, and how the timeline of when we expect students to get it and show up and arrive can shift. Joy as a metric. I think that was Dr. Reynolds who said joy. Let's talk about this joy as a metric and as a way to measure. And I even went on to say as a product. In software development, we might call it a product. And what does that look like? How can we measure joy? Joy. I just saw Inside Out too, by the way, if anyone did, right? And as a product, how can we really think about measuring it and taking things to the next level? Prison Light, school as Prison Light, pretty eye-opening. I'm sure we'll be downloading that for weeks to come. And there were so many things, the zero-sum game, how we can be granularly focused, and the pressure on teachers, right? So just taking a moment to understand the teacher is a human being. And the ethical question of what it is we're trying to be up against today. We're all really three great big points. And things that came up for me that I'd like the Ripe Fruit to continue to work with you all as experts on were things like journey maps that kind of outline that every student's sort of role and journey through different schools. So as teachers come on and sign off, it's not the narrative of one particular teacher who the student rubbed the wrong way, but this sort of more objective, maybe journey that's been captured for a student. Using technology to be more human as opposed to be more efficient. So vibe managers, and Steve will probably laugh at that. Just have a vibe manager in the school if possible. Strategic mentorship, so not around wealth and showing people, but around navigating other humans and navigating this engine and the social classes and the white supremacy that we know exists. And harm reduction, which was one of our final points. So I'm going to launch a poll. I don't think anyone from the audience raised their hand, but if you did just want to jump in for a moment as I turn it back over to Steve to close out the show, I want to thank you all for coming. And again, we're going to put the notes and the resources from our guests out on the Ripe Fruit page.
Thank you, Ebony Kinney. Thank you, panel. Once again, visit ripefruit.org. That's ripefruit.org to contact our panelists and to get more information about this initiative this particular session, as well as the other dozens of sessions that we've done. All of it is housed at ripefruit.org. My name is Stephen King. Thanks for joining me. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Ebony Kinney. And thank you,